Health IQ Podcast. Beyond the Basics, Unlocking the Secrets of Food Labels.
Have you ever taken time to look at all the details on a food label? For many, it seems very confusing, but the label has important information for people trying to adjust their diets. Thank you for joining us today for this important episode of Health IQ. Our special guest today is a retired nutritionist, Jessie Robinson, and our crew today is Joyce Runyon, Rochelle Moon, and Bobby Hockaday, and I am Brenda Bishop. Jessie and I work together teaching a variety of nutrition classes for the past 30 years. And one of the challenges that we noticed all the time was people didn't know how to read labels, and there was a lot of deceptive labeling out there. So we're going to address those issues today. And Jessie, thank you for joining us as we look at some of these. I did grab some containers, and we'll have close-ups of those labels for you guys to look at as we talk. Before we start looking at these labels, I was thinking about some of the deceptive labels that I've had in my label stash over the years. And one of the ones that was most deceptive, I thought, is right about the time that they started making the nutrition recommendations where everybody should be really pushing whole grains. And I had a loaf of white bread, but on the front, it said whole grain white bread on the main part of the label in really big letters. And then when you flipped it over and looked at the ingredients, the whole grain was like the last thing listed. And if you looked really closely at the front, it said made with whole grain. And so really it was white bread that was being deceptive to people, making them think that they were going to have that flavor of white bread, but it was going to be a whole wheat bread. So that one, and then of course, just wheat bread itself, the name wheat bread was one that people were always confused with, because white bread is made with wheat, and wheat bread, unless it says whole grain, is caramel color and wheat and white bread. So I always thought that was something that was very scary. Now I know label laws have updated and there's less deception. So that I don't know if you have any input into some of that.
Well, it still happens because people think that if the caramel colored makes it whole wheat, I guess, because it just says it's wheat bread. And so they get the idea, because real whole grain or whole wheat is that caramel colored, but it's usually darker and it's usually denser. But they get the idea that they're serving or eating whole grain, when actually it's just the caramel coloring in white bread. And that's a very easy thing that people pick up on as a misconception.
Yes. And I know, right before we retired, there was some new label laws that really took away a lot of the deception, but there's still things companies do to make that label more appealing to us. And they do a lot of market research to make us grab that box as opposed to a different box. So I thought we could look at some of the food containers and just talk about some of the things that are on a label, all the different components that are on these labels. And so would you like to sort of talk about those? And then, like I said, they'll put the same label up for them to see in that background.
Okay, this particular one is a mountain trail mix. And so, of course, they're wanting it to appear to be healthy. And if you notice, first thing I noticed was the little tent with the food in it looks like the food pyramid. And it's really not, because what do you see? M&Ms. Well, they're not the most healthy thing you would ever eat. So that, to me, was the number one deception, because if you just picked it up and saw that, you would think that would be true. So it says serving size is 1 pouch. So but the whole container obviously is much more than that. There's 8 servings in this container, so you could serve 8 people the trail mix. And I assume just from what that says that they're in little individual pouches.
Yeah, each serving is in a pouch.
So the amount per serving is 230 calories. That's not the amount in the box. It's the amount in one serving. And if you notice as you break it down, you have to look beyond just, it says total fat 14 grams, but then if you look below that, it tells you how much of it is saturated and how much of it is trans fat, how much cholesterol there is in it, and also the amount of sodium, because we get way overdosed with sodium because everything has a lot of salt because it makes it taste better. And then you get down to the carbohydrates, it says there's 24. Okay, 17 of that is sugar, which is 6 grams of added sugar. So you have to realize that a lot of our food has natural sugar in it, and that's much healthier than table sugar that you add. But you always look for the added sugar because you want to know how much of that you're actually getting in your diet. And then it goes on to list the amount of protein and then some of the vitamins and things like that. So that's kind of how you read a label. You want to be sure that you decipher all the information that's on there.
So that percent daily value, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think that confuses people.
Okay, that they base all of these labels on a 2,000 calorie diet. Well, that depends on the individual person as to how many calories you take in. Mine would be closer to 1,400 or 1,600 because of my body size. So you have to realize that if you are eating a lesser amount, you're getting a lesser amount of what your body needs every day, because you have to scale it back according to your body size, because what a 300-pound man can eat and what I can eat is totally different, because I would weigh the 300 pounds pretty soon if I stayed with that perception. So
on that label, it says that total fat is 18% of a 2,000 calorie diet. So out of your whole day then, which you would get 100% for a whole day, that's almost a fifth of the amount of fat you're allowed to have in a day, if you look at it that way, especially if you're on a less calorie diet than 2,000.
Exactly.
So that, I think, is always confusing. But there's some other clues that we can look at on there. If we're looking at for a low sodium food or something, if it says has, what was it? There's a percentage that we can look at to say, I think if it's 5%, if something is 5%, then it's considered low in that. But if it's over 20%, is it? That
yes,
it's high?
it's high.
So if you look, you can use that for that too. So that would be really getting close, especially if you were on a diet with less calories than 2,000, of being a high-fat food, because it would be 20%.
Okay, and part of that comes from the fact that it's nuts. Nuts are healthy, but in moderation. You can't eat a whole bunch of nuts, just a little handful, maybe a quarter of a cup is the serving size of nuts. It's not half the package that you're eating from. So you have to be real careful with things like that.
I want to talk about that ingredients list.
Okay, and in the ingredients, the first thing listed is what, there's more of it than any of these other things. So the first thing listed is peanuts. So that would give me an indication there's a lot of peanuts in here. That doesn't necessarily mean that's bad. And then the next one is raisins, which is where part of your carbohydrates comes from. But what's in raisins should be natural sugars, not added sugar. So then you have milk chocolate, which of course is added sugar. And it goes on to tell you how much of each thing is in the chocolate. Milk chocolate, it's sugar is the first ingredient. and then chocolate, and then skim milk, and cocoa butter. So the bigger part of that is going to be sugar. And then as we get on down through here, it talks about all the vitamins and stuff that are added in the food colorings, etc. And so then down below actual ingredients, it says it contains milk, almonds, cashews, peanuts, and soy. It may also contain traces of Brazil nuts, coconut, hazelnuts, macadamia nuts, pecans, pine nuts, and the list goes on, and down to wheat and sesame. So if you are dealing with a food allergy, that's very, very important for you to read and study, because if you are allergic to nuts, be it peanuts or whatever, you need to be very careful about that, because I know of an instance where a young man went to a party and he was very allergic to peanuts. Well, he picked up a cookie off of the buffet and ate it, and he died before they got to the hospital. So you have to be very careful if you have a food allergy that is life-threatening, that you read all the labels, or that if you go to a buffet or something, you go around and you ask. If you think you want that cookie, you ask what is in it. And so that is real important. Personally, I'm allergic to onions, so I go around and, well, does that casserole have onions in it? And, like you go to a potluck or a buffet or something. And those things are very important if you have food allergies.
And allergens, there's only 8 that are required to be on a label, if I remember correctly. So things like onions if you're allergic to tomatoes or onions, those are not the things that are listed as under the allergens. So you have to be really careful if you have one of those. You don't have the specific thing that says, don't eat this because it has wheat in it.
So, the wheat and the nuts and some of those things are always listed, but there are a lot of things that aren't listed that people are also allergic to. So, and it depends. I mean, like, it's not real common that you have an allergy that is life-threatening, but peanuts is one of them. And then I had a client one time who was extremely allergic to eggs. If you touched her and you had eaten eggs for breakfast, it would set off an allergic reaction in her. And to try to deal with trying to be sure that that child was fed appropriately, you had to be extremely careful, and particularly in a classroom where people brought refreshments for a party or something like that, you had to be really cautious about those things. So it can be very life-threatening, but for the most of us, it just is an aggravation.
Yes. And gluten's another. There are some people that it's life-threatening for, and others who it's not as life-threatening, but still makes them uncomfortable. So also on a box, we have, I think this one has a good date on it. They're usually dated somewhere, and you have to hunt for them. Oh, this one's on the back. It says, best if used by June 26, 2025. So if it's August 2025, can I still eat that product?
Yes, because it says best if used by. That doesn't mean it expires. But you wouldn't want to, it expires June the 26th of 2025. So you have, from the time you buy it until then, it's perfectly fine. But then you get beyond that, the quality decreases. That doesn't mean that it would harm you to eat it. But if it was 2027 and you were still trying to eat out of this, yes, that would not be good. But
it changes flavor more than safety.
Right. So it tastes stale. It tastes yucky. You can tell these things. But if it says, some of them very specifically say what the expiration date is. But then again, that can be misconception to a degree, because, like, particularly with meats and things like that, if you took it and you froze it, then that would extend that date. But you don't want to get it out of the freezer and it's 3 or 4 years old because the quality would be really decreased, but that doesn't mean it would be unsafe. But if you had not frozen it, definitely you need to use it by, if it says a use by date, because those things can be...
and most meat labels, I think, now have to say use or freeze by. That's what I've been saying.
Right.
Use or freeze
so the
by.
newer ones do usually say that.
So that's quite a bit on that label. And I brought this label, and this one is a little different. It's a gluten-free product. It says it's a low-carb product, but it's a pasta. So what can you tell me about that label?
Well, it says that 26 grams of
this one
of net carbs would be maybe for something else, but then this is down to 2 grams of net carbs because they subtract the fiber from the carbs. If it has, I don't even see where the fiber is on this one, but
it's here. It's really tiny. So they have to have a regular nutrition facts on all boxes or labels, but if the packaging is small, it's really hard to see them sometimes.
Yes, it is, because this is because it has a total 19 grams of carbs. The dietary fiber is 17 grams. So that makes
their net carbs of 2. If you're on a diet that uses net carbs. But if you are a person who has diabetes, that's still 19 grams of carbs, even though it has fiber in it. Fiber, it makes it better. But I think people don't often think, well, that's a free food, and they still don't look at the serving. And they eat the whole box because it's only 2 grams of carbs. It's a free food. and if you look at the servings on this, a serving is sort of deceptive because it says it's a 4 servings per container. And this box, I made half of this box. So this box was only full to about right here. So if I personally made this whole thing and ate this whole thing, that would have been 8 net carbs, but it would have been almost 80 total carbs. And if I was a diabetic, that could cause a lot of issues, even though it's a high fiber food, and fiber is really good. This is not made with a wheat type thing, so it doesn't have that. And one thing that's really cool about this particular product is it only has 2 ingredients on the ingredients label. And sometimes when we have long lists of ingredients, that means we have more of those things that you were reading about on the M&Ms or the candies. They're not really M&Ms.
Right. And so that becomes important in the long scheme of things because you... how much of this extra stuff do you want to put in your body is the way I look at it. If you don't know what it is, you can't pronounce it, you can't spell it, it's probably not good for you. And there's usually a list of a whole bunch of things, which there was on the other label. And so it's like, be careful what you're putting in your body. And if this only has 2 ingredients, that's pretty simple. But this one, on the other hand, probably has...
It doesn't have many either.
It doesn't have very many, but it has more.
But this has a lupini, I think is how you say it, bean flour, and xanthan gum. And for the allergy, it says that bean is part of the peanut family, but it doesn't say don't eat it if you are allergic to peanuts.
You have to be pretty sensitive because a peanut is actually a legume. it's not a true nut. And so if you're allergic to that, you could also be allergic to beans, peas, and other things that are legumes. So you have to be cautious about that and know how your body reacts to it.
So this is a can, and I brought this because I wanted to make sure people realize that facts label is there. It's sometimes hard to see. The Best Buy thing is up here, and you can actually use a can a year after the date. And this particular item is diced tomatoes and green chili original. There's always a recipe. There's usually, and I forgot to say on this one, there's directions on how to prepare it. On the other one, you just have to open it. There's directions on how to prepare it. So this one has some interesting things on the facts label too. I don't know if you want pointing any of those out.
Well, 20 calories per serving. Well, there's 2.5 servings in this container. So you have to account for the serving size. You can't just eat the whole can, although it might taste good.
Mm-hmm.
And then it tells you that there's 0 fat. So there's no saturated fat, no trans fat, no cholesterol, 13% of your daily percent of sodium, and it only has 4 grams of carbs because it's a vegetable, and they usually have less carbs than some of your other foods, and particularly less than fruits. So the total sugars in this is 3 grams if you eat the serving size, and 0 grams of added sugar. So you have to realize that most foods have natural sugar in them, which if not taken in excess, is okay, but it's for the added sugars that really get you in trouble fast.
Mm-hmm. So this one only has, if I remember right, it does have spices. So it has tomatoes, water, chopped green chilies, and salt. But then it has calcium chloride, citric acid, spice, natural flavor to give you some more things. So that if you were having allergy issues, you would need to know what those spices were, which it doesn't list. But once again, the 2.5 is something you need to think about, because even if you ate half of this, which wouldn't be that bad, but if you're on a low sodium diet, that would bring you up to that 20% pretty quick. So one thing I'm not sure we touched on is if people are looking to get that whole grain, because we need to make sure that we get whole grain in our diet, where do they need to look on the label to make sure it has whole grain?
You need to look in the ingredients, and the first thing, if you're looking for whole grains, the first item listed in the ingredients should be whole grains. It should not be like an enriched. This particular one I'm looking at was an enriched macaroni product. It means that they added some nutrients to it, but it's not the whole grain. And if you don't use the whole grain, then you're not getting the fiber. Also, is another thing that you're missing out on. So it needs to be the first ingredient. If it says it's a whole grain, then it should say whole grain, wheat or oats or barley or whatever it happens to be, but that should be the very first ingredient.
So I think we covered most everything on these lists. And of course, you can always find some information online if you have specific allergies and things like that. But one of our contractors' husband was recently diagnosed with a gluten allergy, and she found a helpful app on her phone, for her phone. And this is a really cool app. When you set your phone up, you tell it what your needs are. And he has diabetes, and this gluten thing. And then you go to a product and you scan it with your phone. You scan the barcode, and it tells you if it's a good or a bad food. And so with people with multiple issues, I can see that would be really good. And this app, she showed us. So when she was showing me this app, she scanned something that I assumed was gluten-free because it was made with rice. And it came out as a bad food because the rice itself was coated with malt, and malt is made from wheat. And I would have never thought about that. I've even served those to people who are on a low gluten diet and not realized that they were not gluten-free. So this could be really helpful for someone who has one of those allergies that's not in the top 8 allergies that they list on a product. And the app is called Yuka, Yuka. So, and I'm sure there's other apps out there, but there's a paid version and a free version of this. And she has found it very helpful. So we like to end our podcast with some reflections on a quote. And I thought we would do, make your own choices in the light of your own wisdom. I think that sort of fit what we talked about today, because gaining wisdom on things like what to look for on a label, what some of those ingredients are that you may not know, can really help you make some choices. And I think you had a little different take on that when we were talking about it.
Well, I just happen to talk to a lot of people. And so sometimes even they go to a physician and they tell you to eat something or other. A lady told me that they told her she needed to be on a fat diet. I was like, oh, what? And she said, a fat diet. And I said, well, what is that? Well, she didn't know. But I think the point of that was that she needed to gain weight. And you have to understand that providers do not have the amount of education that nutritionists and dietitians do when it comes to things like that. So you have to be careful that you understand what they're talking about so that you can relate it back to things like this about your wisdom. You have to gain that wisdom by asking questions. A lot of people just, oh, okay. But they come away and they have no idea what they really are supposed to be looking for.
Yeah. So thank you, Jessie, for joining us today for this informative podcast. And be sure to come back next episode as we will have another great guest.
Special thanks to our guest contributor for this episode, Jessie Robinson, retired nutritionist and HEAL committee member. Our host for this episode was Brenda Bishop, Quay County Health Council Coordinator. Health IQ podcast crew. Our director was Robert F. Hockaday. Producers are Robert F. Hockaday and Joyce Runyon. Second assistant camera was Joyce Runyon. Third assistant camera was Rochelle Moon. Editors are Joyce Runyon and Robert F. Hockaday. Funding for Health IQ provided by a New Mexico Better Together grant, brought to you by the Quay County Health Council. Follow us on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram at Quay County Health. If you have any content ideas, reach out to us by email, healthikpodcast@gmail.com. More info about this topic and more available on our Health IQ blog, QCHEALTHCO.uncil.org.
This podcast was created solely for educational and entertainment purposes. It is not intended as a substitute for advice from a healthcare or mental health professional.